This program has been made possible by the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass and by the generous financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.
For centuries, glassblowing was confined to factories, and the skills of the trade were secrets revealed slowly over years through apprenticeship. Their work reflected production and marketing strategies over subtlety of form and aesthetic values. But the invention of glassblowing machines revolutionized the industry. The factories transitioned from the handmade work of old-world craftsmen to the rapid-fire reproductions of machines, marking the end of industrial glassblowers. But the vision of Harvey Littleton and a workshop at the Toledo Museum of Art in 1962 brought glassblowing out of the factories and opened up a new world for artists.
Harvey Littleton grew up in Corning, New York, and he had the idea that if people could do pottery in their garage or their backyard, why couldn't they build a small glass furnace and do glass in much the same way?
Research workers of the Corning Glass Company in New York have evolved a new process for the manufacture of heat-resistant glass.
Harvey came from a very technical background. His dad was Jesse Littleton, who developed Pyrex, and he was kind of the black sheep artist in the family.
His father was unique because he was the first man with a PhD in physics to be hired by the American Glass Company to conduct research. He brought science to the glass industry, and Harvey brought glass to the art world.
Harvey wanted to show everybody that you didn't have to be affiliated with major industry or factory to make art out of glass. That you could build a little box and put it in your garage and run a gas pipe into it and melt glass and make stuff. And that it really should be introduced as a material for artists to use for self-expression.
As a teenager, Harvey was starting to argue with his father because he wanted to be an artist, and his father said, get a degree in industrial design and be a designer for Steuben. Harvey wanted to make the glass himself, and his father said, well, you can't do that. It's impossible for an artist to blow glass. You have to hire the workers. And everybody in the glass industry assumed that glass could only be made by a team of men working together. And this is the way it had been done ever since the Romans invented the blowpipe.
The glass people always had gaffers and goofers and all the thing, people to help them gather, another one to hand them this stuff and so on. And this was literally doing it all yourself.
Artists were employed by the glass industry as designers only, and glassblowers were skilled workmen who spent years in apprenticeships learning their trade.
They were given a drawing, or they were given a model that was designed by an artist who was trained as a designer to give this information to the craftsman, and the craftsman would translate it into blown glass.
In the factories, their designs were often dictated by what people were buying, more so than what the designer said was a good design.
Littleton took a job teaching ceramics at the Toledo Museum of Art in 1949, while Otto Wittmann was the museum's assistant director. Although Littleton left to teach at the University of Wisconsin, he kept in contact with Otto Wittmann while he was the director of the Toledo Museum.
When I left Toledo to go to Wisconsin, we parted in very good company. And in fact, during the 50s, I went back to Otto for recommendations for things like the Guggenheim or some other grant that I was applying for.
He applied for grants from every foundation that supported the arts. 58 to 61, he was constantly applying, and nobody would give him a grant to do research in glassblowing.
Littleton began experimenting in a studio on his farm in Wisconsin with promising results.
He started blowing glass in his studio by simply taking an old pottery kiln, put one of his unglazed stoneware bowls in it and filled it with batch and would heat it up until it melted and then tried to blow it. And he made a number of small vessels, vases, and paperweights. Later that summer, he drove to Corning, New York to visit his parents, and on the way he stopped in Toledo. He showed the paperweights to Otto Wittmann, and Otto was impressed. He told Harvey that he would support him, but he wouldn't support his efforts to do research in glass in Madison, only in Toledo.
He had a theory that one ought to be able to make glass the same way you make pottery. And I said, well, how are you going to do that? He said, well, I'm going to invite a few of my friends in the pottery business who are teaching pottery, and we're going to come together in the summer, and we're going to try to melt some glass and make some, see if we can't do it.
Harvey and I met in Otto Wittmann's office. He showed up with a handful of small pieces of glass, some that he had carved and polished. This was kind of impressive. He was energetic, very positive, had complete faith in himself and what he was doing.
Wittmann agreed to host Littleton's workshop at the Toledo Museum of Art, and he asked Norm Schulman, the museum's ceramic instructor, to help.
Schulman was the nuts and bolts man that knew how to make burners and knew how to stack up bricks and build furnaces. And Otto Wittmann said to Norm, I want you to make this happen.
I knew the glass was just a beautiful material, and that if something came of it, it would be well worthwhile. And if nothing came of it, well, you know, it's the old saying, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
We cooked up a letter which we wrote to the deans of University of Michigan, University of Indiana, and a number of other schools, inviting my friends to take part in this historic workshop, which we had no idea anything would happen. But we did it anyway. And so their schools sent them to Toledo in March of 1962.
I was in my first year of teaching at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa. I remember the day I got the flyer, and I was so excited. I was afraid I wouldn't get in the workshop. It was limited to 10 potters. And so I called the museum and got my name in immediately so I could be in the workshop. And actually, they didn't fill it. There were only 9 people that signed up.
Harvey Littleton came to the museum, and he was my first pottery teacher. When Harvey came back for the glass, I said, I'd like to take it. No, it's only for the university professors and so on. Then a week before the class started, Norm came up and he said, if you still want to take the class, you can. It couldn't be filled. So I went right over to the museum, paid my $50, and I took the first glass workshop.
I got the trustees to give me enough money to take over one of the buildings on the museum ground, and there I allowed them to build this kiln because the trustees said, we don't want any fire like that inside the museum. You might set the whole museum on fire.
Otto Wittmann also invited glass engineer Dominick Labino to attend. He was vice president and director of research for Johns Manville Fiberglass, and he held over 100 patents for advances in glassmaking, including technology used to create the windows on the Apollo spacecraft and the insulating tiles on the space shuttle. Labino was also an aspiring artist, a modern-day Renaissance man.
He was an amateur potter, he was an amateur enamelist, had done some painting. He tried everything. And I think Otto simply thought this was something that Nick should do simply because Nick was interested in every kind of artistic pursuit.
Labino would help develop the technology for Littleton's dream.
It was during spring vacation of '62. I joined Harvey and Clayton Bailey, who was Harvey's assistant at the time, and the 3 of us drove out to Toledo.
We had taken the furnace from my house, my studio, and we'd installed it with Norm Schulman's help.
He invited us to spend the night with him the first night in Toledo, And in the morning at breakfast, we discovered that Harvey and Clayton and I hadn't slept all night. All three of us laid there awake thinking about this workshop because we were so excited.
The initial excitement everyone felt soon turned to frustration when things didn't go as well as expected.
Harvey's plan was to put stoneware pots into the kiln and put chemicals in the pots, use the pots as crucibles to hold the chemicals to melt them into glass. And he used formulas that were designed for factories.
So we mixed the glass and melted it. Well, it didn't melt very good because we had screwed up the formula. So then we called on Nick, and Nick came in and looked at it and said, you got to get rid of all that stuff. And so we did by tearing the furnace apart. Tuesday night, we took it apart, and we had it back together again by Wednesday. And Nick brought us some of his marbles that they used to make fiberglass. And we just threw them in and melted them. And then by Wednesday night, we had glass to play with.
At the same time, he redesigned the furnace so that instead of being a crucible furnace, it became a tank. And it became the furnace that Nick Labino was famous for and that everyone in the early years in the United States used. A top-fired, small, hard brick furnace.
We immediately split up into groups so we could blow glass all night.
We didn't know what we were doing. I think we'd seen a movie in the Museum of Glassblowers. My lack of skill was unimportant. It was just very exciting just to work with it.
Toledo's glass industry supplied blowpipes and hardware, but experienced glassblowers were in short supply, and what looked simple on film proved difficult to master.
If you could get a bubble at the end of the blowpipe and get it off the blowpipe when you're through, that was the big achievement.
As soon as they'd get glass on the end and blow it and get a bubble, the bubble would collapse on them. They didn't know what to do.
It was a unique experience. It was wonderful because I think it's the only time that I can remember in my life where nobody knew anything.
My feelings were that since we were in Toledo, we should involve the old glassblowers. I just felt that they would have information that would be useful to us. If we had some sort of a public program and send invitations out, somebody would show up. And Harvey gave a lecture, and after the lecture he had these pieces of glass out there and talking, and this old guy came over and holding it and everything, and he started talking to Harvey. And it turned out that he was sort of the dean of the old glassblowers. It was Harvey Leafgreen.
And this little man came with a shirt and tie and jacket and vest. You know, he'd worked for Libby Glass, and he was a glassblower.
He had started working in glass when he was about 6 years old in Sweden, carrying water buckets back and forth to the various glassblowers, and then grew up through the ranks and moved along and became one of the best glassblowers in the United States.
Harvey Leafgreen was very impressed. He said, you've never blown glass before and you're making these things. And so he had immediately see our furnace, so we all trooped out to the garage behind the museum where the furnace was.
Took off his coat and he blew glass. He gathered and he blew and he put his thumb over the end of the blowpipe and the bubble came out.
And he immediately started blowing glass for us and demonstrated, and then asked each of us what we wanted to make, what kind of object we'd like to make in glass. And then he showed us exactly how to do it.
And that was all totally serendipitous. When we could recognize who he was, that he was a glassblower, and get him to do it, it was very delightful.
And I felt that that was the beginning of the studio glass movement, where a person, an artist or a person, could come in and blow.
Harvey and Clayton and I went home very excited. Harvey was filled with a possibility, realized that finally he was getting started, and this was now when things were really going to take off, and he was right.
A second workshop was held at the Toledo Museum of Art in June of '62. Harvey Littleton went back to the University of Wisconsin and started a glass program. When he wasn't crusading for other universities to establish programs of their own, he was teaching future studio glass luminaries like Marvin Lipovsky, Fritz Dreisbach, and Dale Chihuly. In turn, Littleton's students graduated and started teaching as well.
The idea that Littleton had was teach the teachers, and then the teachers would go out and teach. And that's what we almost all of us did. And when I was there were 12 of us in the program. I don't know where that number came from. It just coincides with the same number of disciples in the Bible. And that's what we were doing, is spreading the gospel.
In the years following the '62 workshop, Norm Schulman left the Toledo Museum and started the glass program at the Rhode Island School of Design. Nick Labino retired from his job in the glass industry and built a studio of his own, where he used his extensive knowledge of glass to mix his own formulas and colors.
Nick was not a trained artist, but he was an extremely sensitive person and creative person who could put together all of these things. He was challenged by what we were doing.
He had to teach himself art, so he used the museum's collection. He'd go into the museum, he'd look at pieces, he'd say, I can do that, he'd go home and do it.
These objects look Egyptian, and one museum director did indeed think they were Egyptian and offered their owner several $1,000s for them. But they were made by their owner, Nick Labino, a former vice president in charge of research for a big glass company, and the man who taught Harvey Littleton most of the rudiments of blowing glass.
You must be a good craftsman. After that, you can go places. And I always relate crafts to golfing, because there are a lot of golfers and there are very few Arnold Palmers. And I think there are a lot of craftsmen. There are not very many that, like Cellini and a few more. But these people did very nice work. Michelangelo, goodness, you can name many of them. They were inventive. They had imagination. And somehow we always lose the word imagination.
Frankly, artistically, I think Nick's greatest contribution are the cast pieces, the panels, the groups of panels. The Vitrano is still one of the most breathtaking pieces of glass I've ever seen.
Harvey Littleton eventually left teaching to concentrate on his own art.
Glass has unique properties. Its light transmission, its color, its resistance to wear, its fluidity under the fire, its ability to be handled. All of these things make it an extremely exciting material for artists to use. This is quite different. We're not teaching a craft. We're simply introducing artists to another medium.
He's gone through several styles over the years, and I think that's what he always tried to encourage in his students, was to really explore it. Don't get trapped in making bottles and vases. In fact, he made a statement once many years ago, which has haunted him ever since, and that was that he said the technique is cheap. And I think by that he meant that a lot of young people were learning classic approaches to working with glass, which for the most part is making vessels, and learning it very well. But I think his point was that you can learn that and you can make all these vessels, but you haven't really taken the material and explored it very successfully. You've just sort of allowed yourself to kind of get trapped in what's been going on for centuries and centuries, as opposed to using it as a material to express yourself and speak about your own ideas.
Littleton and Labino became the pioneering leaders of the studio glass movement, and their groundbreaking work inspired glass artists worldwide. Over the last 50 years, the studio glass movement has spread in infinite directions, limited only by imagination and creativity. And the choice of what to make has been placed firmly in the hands of the artist, passed down from industry and passed on to us.
You can't compare glassblowers from industry to us. The skill to blow glass as an artist is the skill to make each experience a richer one, to make each form better. Whereas the skill of a man in a factory is to make each piece the same as the one before, because that's what the factory is selling. You know, if they've got a bubble in the stem, they've got a bubble the same size in every stem. Whereas we don't do that. We make everything different. That's what it is to be an artist.
Over the years, the number of artists blowing glass has grown exponentially, spreading like the branches of an extended family tree.
Most of the people that are blowing today are descended from the Toledo workshops. Leaf Green was the great-great-great-great-grandfather, and then Littleton, McLaughlin. I was a student of McLaughlin, so that makes me like third generation. And then my students are fourth generation, and their students are fifth generation, and we're now probably into the 10th generation. I don't even know. It's grown so much. It's so rapid. All over the United States, there's glass everywhere.
It's sort of like Alice stepping through the looking glass. Who would believe what was behind there? Who would know? People ask me, did I know? No, I didn't know. Did I dream about it? Sure. Every damn night I dreamed about making glass. What could be made?
50 years after the first glass-blowing workshop at the Toledo Museum of Art, glass exhibitions, lectures, and workshops commemorating that event are taking place in communities and museums all over the country, where studio art glass is nurtured, valued, and put on display for an eager public. Artists from all over the world now dream about glass, like Harvey did, and what can be made.
This program has been made possible by the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass and by the generous financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.